What happens to a kingdom when its founder is no longer welcome within its walls? Before we begin this journey through the rise and fall of one of Hollywood's most remarkable dynasties, I want to thank you for being here. If this channel's work resonates with you, consider subscribing. We are working toward 1,000 supporters who share a passion for these untold histories. On the morning of March 2nd, 1936, the gates of Universal City opened as they had every day for more than 2 decades. The California sun climbed over the San Fernando Valley, casting long shadows across sound stages that had witnessed the birth of an industry. But on this particular morning, something fundamental had shifted. The man who had built this empire from nothing, who had transformed 230 acres of chicken farms into the largest motion picture production facility in the world, was no longer its master. Karl Laemmle, the diminutive immigrant from Laupheim, Germany, had signed away his creation. The paperwork was complete. The bankers had won. There were no ceremonies that morning, no speeches, no formal acknowledgement of the transfer of power that had just occurred. The cameras kept rolling on whatever productions remained in active development. The electricians and carpenters and costume designers reported to their stations as if nothing had changed, and perhaps for them, nothing had. Studios changed hands. Executives came and went. The machinery of entertainment ground forward, regardless of whose name appeared on the ownership documents. But for Karl Laemmle, that morning marked the end of something that could never be recovered. He was 69 years old. He had spent the better part of 3 decades building Universal into a monument to his vision, his determination, his peculiar combination of showmanship and sentimentality. Now he was being ushered toward the exit, his departure cushioned by financial arrangements that would keep him comfortable but could never compensate for what had been taken. The official explanation was straightforward enough. Universal had accumulated debts it could not service. The transition to sound cinema had proven more expensive than anticipated. The Great Depression had devastated theater attendance. A series of costly productions had failed to find audiences. The studio needed capital that Laemmle could not provide, and the only way to secure that capital was to surrender control to a consortium of investors led by J. Cheever Cowden and the Standard Capital Corporation. This narrative had the virtue of being technically accurate. Every element could be verified through financial records and board minutes and correspondence between lawyers. Yet it told only a fraction of the story. It explained the mechanism of Laemmle's removal without addressing the deeper currents that had made that removal necessary, or perhaps inevitable. Those who had watched Universal's operations closely in the years leading up to the transfer understood that the studio's financial troubles were symptoms of something more fundamental. Karl Laemmle had built Universal according to principles that made perfect sense in the silent era, but proved catastrophic when the industry transformed. He had trusted family over expertise. He had valued loyalty above competence. He had created a corporate culture that rewarded personal connections rather than professional achievement. The results of this philosophy were visible throughout Universal City. Laemmle's relatives occupied positions at every level of the organization. His son Carl Jr. had been installed as head of production at the age of 21, a decision that generated both remarkable successes and spectacular failures. Cousins and nephews and in-laws filled administrative roles for which they possessed varying degrees of qualification. The studio's payroll read like a family reunion rather than a professional enterprise. This arrangement had functioned adequately when the motion picture industry operated on smaller scales, when personal relationships mattered more than systematic management, when the line between family business and corporate enterprise remained blurred. But as Hollywood matured, as the studios grew into industrial operations requiring sophisticated coordination of technical and financial and creative resources, Laemmle's approach became increasingly untenable. The transition to sound had exposed every weakness in Universal's structure. The technology required massive capital investment. The talent required specialized skills that family connections could not provide. The competitive landscape demanded strategic thinking that went beyond instinct and sentiment. Lemmel found himself presiding over an organization that was fundamentally unprepared for the challenges it faced. By 1935, the situation had become critical. Universal's debt exceeded $13 million. The studio's credit was exhausted. Production schedules were being disrupted by shortages of operating capital. The board of directors, increasingly dominated by outside investors who had provided emergency financing in previous years, began discussing options that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. Carl Laemmle resisted as long as he could. He explored merger possibilities with other studios. He sought additional financing from banks that had already extended themselves beyond prudent limits. He proposed restructuring plans that would preserve some measure of family control while satisfying creditor demands. None of these alternatives proved viable. The final negotiations took place in offices far from Universal City, in boardrooms where lawyers and accountants spoke languages that Laemmle understood only imperfectly. The terms were not cruel, but they were absolute. Laemmle and his son would receive approximately $5 million for their shares in the company. In exchange, they would relinquish all authority over the studio's operations. The Laemmle era at Universal was ending. The story of how Carl Laemmle came to build his empire begins not in California, but in a small town in the Kingdom of Württemberg, in what would later become Germany. Laupheim was an unremarkable place, distinguished primarily by its unusually large Jewish community and its distance from anything resembling opportunity. Carl was born there in January of 1867, the 10th of 13 children in a family that struggled to provide for so many mouths. His father dealt in real estate and property management, occupations that provided modest stability but little prospect of advancement. The Laemmle household was crowded, resources were stretched thin, and the children understood from early ages that their futures would need to be constructed elsewhere. For Carl, that elsewhere would be America. He arrived in New York in 1884, 17 years old, carrying almost nothing of material value. What he possessed instead was a particular kind of ambition, not the grandiose dreams of instant wealth that drew so many immigrants to disappointment, but something more practical. He wanted security. He wanted respectability. He wanted to build something that would endure. His early years in America followed patterns common to immigrants of his generation. He moved westward, settling eventually in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, where he found work as a bookkeeper and errand boy for a clothing store. The work was tedious but educational. He learned how businesses operated, how money flowed, how customers could be attracted and retained. He learned the value of advertising, of promotion, of making noise in markets crowded with competitors. By 1898, Laemmle had saved enough to purchase a stake in a clothing store in Oshkosh. He was 31 years old, established, respectable, precisely the kind of solid citizen his father might have hoped he would become. He married Recha Stern, started a family, and seemed destined for a comfortable but unremarkable life in the American heartland. Then he encountered the Nickelodeons. The precise moment of his conversion remains unclear. Some accounts place it in Chicago, where Laemmle had traveled on business and wandered into one of the storefront theaters that were beginning to appear throughout American cities. Others suggest he first experienced the new medium closer to home. What matters is the effect it produced. Carl Laemmle, conservative businessman, cautious investor, respectable family man, saw motion pictures and recognized immediately that he was witnessing the future. In 1906, he liquidated his interest in the clothing business and used the proceeds to open his first Nickelodeon in Chicago. The White Front Theatre, as he called it, was modest by any standard. A converted storefront with wooden chairs and a single projector. But it was his, and it was profitable almost immediately. Within 2 years, Lemmel had expanded to a chain of theatres across the Midwest. He had discovered something essential about his own nature. He was not merely a businessman, but a showman. He understood instinctively how to attract attention, how to generate excitement, how to transform mundane transactions into experiences that customers would remember and repeat. His promotional techniques became legendary within the industry. He staged elaborate publicity stunts. He engaged in advertising campaigns of unprecedented scale and audacity. When he needed films to show in his theaters, he established relationships with production companies and distribution networks. When those relationships proved insufficient, he began considering whether he might produce films himself. The motion picture industry in those early years was controlled by a cartel known as the Motion Picture Patents Company, an alliance of established producers who had pooled their patents and sought to exclude competitors from the market. Edison, Biograph, Vitagraph, and their partners charged licensing fees that independent operators like Lemmel found increasingly burdensome. They restricted access to equipment, to film stock, to distribution networks. They operated, in essence, as a trust designed to strangle competition. Carl Lemmel refused to be strangled. In 1909, he established the Independent Moving Pictures Company, IMP, in direct defiance of the Patents Company. The name itself was a declaration of war. He would produce his own films, distribute them through his own networks, and challenge the established order of the industry. The Patents Company responded with legal action, with intimidation, with efforts to cut off Lemmel's access to supplies and markets. Lemmel responded with publicity. He understood that his battle against the trust could be transformed into a narrative that would attract sympathy from exhibitors and audiences alike. He was David against Goliath, the independent entrepreneur fighting monopolistic oppression. His most brilliant stroke came in 1910, when he orchestrated what became known as the first publicity stunt in motion picture history. Florence Lawrence, a popular actress who had appeared in numerous films but remained anonymous according to industry practice, was working for Lemmel's IMP company. The Patents Company studios kept their performers nameless, believing that identified stars would demand higher salaries. Lemmel saw an opportunity. He planted a story in newspapers claiming that Florence Lawrence had been killed in a streetcar accident. Then, after the story had circulated and generated attention, he announced that the report was a lie spread by enemies of IMP, and that Lawrence was alive, well, and appearing exclusively in his productions. The stunt was manipulative, dishonest, and spectacularly effective. It established Lawrence as the first-named movie star and demonstrated that Lemmel understood something his competitors did not. In the entertainment industry, attention was the most valuable currency of all. The victory over the Patents Company was not achieved through a single battle, but through a war of attrition that lasted years. Lemmel merged IMP with several other independent producers in 1912 to form the Universal Film Manufacturing Company. The name was chosen deliberately. It suggested scope, ambition, a reach that would extend across the entire world. Carl Lemmel was no longer merely an exhibitor who had stumbled into production. He was building an empire. The early years of Universal were characterized by constant motion, by expansion in every direction simultaneously. The company produced films at facilities scattered across the New York area, in New Jersey, and the Bronx, and wherever space could be rented cheaply. But Lemmel understood that this fragmented approach could not sustain the scale of operations he envisioned. He needed a permanent home, a place where every aspect of production could be consolidated under his direct control. California had been attracting motion picture producers for several years by the time Laemmle turned his attention westward. The climate offered consistent sunlight for outdoor filming. The varied landscape provided locations that could substitute for almost any setting imaginable. And the distance from New York placed producers beyond the easy reach of the patents company's enforcers and process servers. In 1914, Laemmle acquired 230 acres in the San Fernando Valley, north of the small community of Hollywood. The land had been used for chicken farming and agriculture, unremarkable terrain that offered nothing to recommend it except space and affordability. Laemmle saw something else entirely. He saw Universal City. The name was not merely promotional hyperbole. Laemmle intended to build an actual city, a self-contained community dedicated entirely to the production of motion pictures. There would be sound stages and backlots, certainly, but also restaurants and shops, a hospital, a school, a fire department, a police force. The workers who created Universal's films would live and work within its boundaries, their entire existence oriented around the needs of production. Construction began almost immediately after the land was acquired. Laemmle drove the project with characteristic impatience, demanding that facilities be completed faster than seemed possible, accepting temporary structures when permanent ones could not be built quickly enough. By March of 1915, Universal City was ready for its official opening. The dedication ceremony was vintage Laemmle, extravagant, theatrical, designed to generate maximum publicity. Thousands of guests were transported to the site by special trains. Politicians and celebrities mingled with ordinary citizens who had been invited to witness the birth of what Laemmle proclaimed would be the greatest motion picture facility in the world. The day included tours of the production facilities, demonstrations of filmmaking techniques, and speeches celebrating the dawn of a new era in entertainment. What the guests witnessed was genuinely impressive. Universal City contained multiple stages for indoor filming, extensive backlots where permanent sets replicated streets and buildings from around the world, workshops for constructing props and scenery, laboratories for processing film, and administrative buildings where the business of the studio was conducted. Nothing on this scale had been attempted before in the motion picture industry. But Laemmle's most innovative decision involved the public itself. Rather than treating Universal City as a closed industrial facility, he opened it to visitors. For a small admission fee, anyone could enter the grounds, watch films being made, observe the mysterious processes by which entertainment was manufactured. The studio became a tourist attraction, a destination that drew curious visitors from across the country. This openness served multiple purposes. The admission fees generated revenue that helped offset production costs. The visitors provided a ready supply of extras for crowd scenes, reducing labor expenses. And the publicity generated by the tours kept Universal's name constantly before the public, reinforcing brand recognition in ways that conventional advertising could not match. Carl Laemmle had created something unprecedented, a factory for dreams that was itself a dream, a working industrial facility that doubled as a fantasy land where ordinary people could glimpse the machinery behind their entertainment. The contradiction at the heart of this arrangement never seemed to trouble him. He was selling magic while simultaneously revealing how the tricks were performed. The films that Universal produced during these early years reflected Laemmle's particular sensibilities. He favored melodramas and serials, stories that moved quickly and appealed to broad audiences. He was not especially interested in artistic prestige or critical acclaim. He wanted pictures that would fill theaters, that would generate reliable returns on investment, that would keep the machinery of Universal City operating at capacity. This approach proved remarkably successful. By the early 1920s, Universal had established itself as one of the major studios, producing hundreds of films annually and distributing them through a network that reached theaters across America and around the world. Lemmel's personal fortune grew correspondingly. The immigrant boy from Laupheim had become one of the wealthiest men in Hollywood. His wealth manifested in ways both expected and surprising. He acquired properties in Beverly Hills and maintained residences appropriate to his station. He traveled extensively, returning frequently to Germany to visit relatives who had remained in Laupheim. These visits were triumphant processions, the hometown boy who had conquered America, returning to demonstrate his success to those who had known him when he was nobody. But Lemmel's wealth also expressed itself through generosity that went far beyond conventional philanthropy. He seemed constitutionally incapable of refusing requests for help from anyone who could claim even the most tenuous connection to his past. Relatives appeared from Germany expecting employment, and employment was provided. Friends of relatives appeared expecting the same, and they too were accommodated. The network of obligation expanded continuously, drawing more and more people into Universal's orbit. The phenomenon became so pronounced that it acquired its own mythology within the industry. A popular joke circulated through Hollywood: Uncle Carl Laemmle has a very large Fiemmel. The wordplay was crude, but the observation was accurate. By some estimates, more than 70 of Laemmle's relatives held positions at Universal by the mid-1920s. The studio had become a family enterprise in the most literal sense, a vast apparatus for providing employment to anyone who shared blood or marriage ties with its founder. Laemmle seemed genuinely unable to perceive the problems this arrangement created. In his understanding, loyalty to family was not merely a virtue, but the highest virtue, the foundation upon which all other obligations rested. He had succeeded in America, and that success carried with it responsibilities to those who had not been so fortunate. If he possessed the power to help his relatives, how could he justify refusing to do so? The consequences of this philosophy accumulated gradually. Positions were filled based on connection rather than competence. Decisions were made to accommodate family sensitivities rather than business necessities. The organizational structure of Universal became increasingly difficult to navigate, with lines of authority blurred by personal relationships that superseded professional hierarchies. Yet the studio continued to function, continued to produce films, continued to generate profits sufficient to sustain its operations. The inefficiencies created by Laemmle's nepotism were absorbed by an industry that was itself inefficient, that operated on instinct and improvisation rather than systematic management. As long as the pictures kept coming and the audiences kept paying, the underlying weaknesses remained invisible. The most consequential expression of Laemmle's family loyalty involved his son. Carl Laemmle Jr. had grown up within the studio system, had absorbed its rhythms and assumptions from childhood. He possessed genuine intelligence and real enthusiasm for motion pictures. He also possessed his father's name and the expectations that accompanied it. In 1928, on his 21st birthday, Junior was appointed head of production at Universal. The decision was unprecedented, even by Hollywood standards. Other studios were run by experienced showmen who had spent decades learning their craft. Universal was now entrusting its creative future to a young man whose primary qualification was his parentage. The appointment reflected Laemmle's deepest convictions about family and legacy. He was 61 years old, conscious that his years of active leadership were numbered. He wanted to believe that the empire he had built would pass to his son, that the Laemmle name would remain synonymous with Universal for generations to come. Junior's elevation was not merely a business decision, but an act of dynastic succession. What followed was more complicated than either triumph or disaster. Carl Laemmle Jr. possessed abilities that his critics were reluctant to acknowledge. He had taste, Or at least he had the capacity to recognize taste in others and to give talented people room to work. Under his leadership, Universal produced some of the most remarkable films in its history. The horror cycle that defined Universal's identity for decades began under Junior's supervision. Dracula, released in 1931, demonstrated that audiences had appetite for supernatural terror when it was presented with sufficient style. Frankenstein followed later that same year, establishing conventions that would influence horror cinema for generations. The Mummy, The Invisible Man, Bride of Frankenstein, each emerged from the production system that Junior oversaw. These films were not merely successful commercially, they possessed artistic qualities that distinguished them from ordinary studio product. The German expressionist influence is visible in their visual design, the psychological complexity of their monsters, the atmospheric density of their storytelling. These elements reflected choices made by directors and cinematographers and designers who had been given unusual freedom to pursue their visions. Junior also championed prestige productions that enhanced Universal's reputation within the industry. All Quiet on the Western Front, released in 1930, won the Academy Award for Best Picture and demonstrated that Universal could compete with the major studios on terms of quality as well as quantity. The film's anti-war message resonated with audiences still processing the trauma of the Great War, and its commercial success suggested that serious subjects could find popular acceptance. But alongside these achievements, Junior displayed tendencies that would prove catastrophic. He was extravagant in ways that exceeded even Hollywood norms. Productions under his supervision regularly exceeded their budgets, sometimes dramatically. He seemed unable or unwilling to impose fiscal discipline on projects that excited his enthusiasm. The transition to sound cinema magnified every weakness in Universal's financial structure. The technology required enormous capital investment, new equipment for production, new systems for distribution, renovations to theaters across the country. Studios with deeper resources and more conservative management navigated the transition with difficulty. Universal, burdened by existing inefficiencies and led by executives who prioritized artistic ambition over financial prudence, found itself in increasingly desperate circumstances. The Great Depression arrived at precisely the wrong moment. Theater attendance collapsed, as audiences who had once spent freely on entertainment found themselves struggling to afford necessities. The reliable revenues that had sustained Universal's operations evaporated. The debts accumulated during the transition to sound became impossible to service. Laemmle sought solutions with increasing desperation. He borrowed from banks that demanded ever more onerous terms. He accepted investment from outside parties who acquired corresponding influence over studio decisions. He cut production budgets and reduced staff, measures that damaged morale without fundamentally addressing the structural problems that plagued the organization. The boardroom dynamics shifted perceptibly as Universal's financial position deteriorated. Laemmle had always maintained control through ownership, through the simple fact that he and his family held sufficient shares to outvote any opposition. But the financing arrangements he had been forced to accept diluted that control incrementally. Each loan, each investment, each emergency infusion of capital came with conditions that reduced the Laemmle family's autonomy. The outside investors who now held significant stakes in Universal viewed the studio's operations with increasing alarm. They saw the nepotism, the budget overruns, the organizational dysfunction that Laemmle either could not or would not address. They saw a valuable asset being mismanaged by people whose primary qualification was their relationship to the founder, and they began discussing alternatives. J. Cheever Cowden emerged as the central figure in these discussions. A financier with interests in various entertainment enterprises, Cowden represented a consortium of investors who believed Universal could be salvaged if its leadership was replaced. He approached Lemmel with proposals that were framed as partnerships, but contained unmistakable implications. The studio needed professional management. The family needed to step aside. Lemmel resisted these overtures for as long as resistance remained possible. He explored every alternative, sought financing from every source, attempted to negotiate arrangements that would preserve some measure of family control. His efforts were complicated by his son's continued extravagance. Junior seemed oblivious to the gravity of the situation, continuing to approve expensive productions even as the studio's credit evaporated. Showboat, released in 1936, exemplified the contradiction at the heart of Universal's final years under Lemmel management. The film was a genuine artistic achievement, a lavish adaptation of the celebrated musical that demonstrated Universal's capacity to produce entertainment of the highest quality. It was also ruinously expensive, its costs far exceeding any reasonable expectation of return. The picture that should have demonstrated Junior's abilities instead confirmed his critics' worst assessments. By late 1935, Lemmel's options had narrowed to the point of invisibility. The banks that held Universal's debt were demanding resolution. The outside investors were demanding change. The studio's operations were grinding toward paralysis as suppliers refused credit and production stalled for lack of funds. Something had to give. The negotiations that followed were conducted largely without Lemmel's meaningful participation. Lawyers and accountants representing various parties met in offices far from Universal City, crafting arrangements that would determine the studio's future. Lemmel was consulted, his preferences were noted, but the fundamental decisions had already been made by people who controlled resources he could not match. The terms of the final agreement reflected the weakness of Lemmel's position. He and Junior would receive approximately $5 million for their shares, a substantial sum, but far less than the enterprise was worth under competent management. In exchange, they would surrender all authority over Universal's operations. The studio would continue to bear the name Lemmel had given it, but the Lemmel family would have no further role in its direction. The transaction closed in March of 1936. Carl Lemmel walked away from the empire he had spent 3 decades building, his departure cushioned by money, but marked by unmistakable defeat. He was 69 years old, too young for retirement, but too old and too tired to start again. The future stretched before him as a landscape emptied of purpose. The industry he had helped create observed his departure with the mixture of sentiment and pragmatism that characterized Hollywood's treatment of fallen figures. Tributes were offered, contributions were acknowledged, but the attention of the town had already shifted to whatever came next. Universal, under new management, would face its own challenges and opportunities. Carl Lemmel had become history. His final years were spent in comfortable obscurity. He maintained his residence in Beverly Hills, received visitors who wished to pay respects, and watched from a distance as the studio he had built evolved in directions he could not have anticipated. The horror films that Junior had championed continued to define Universal's identity. The monsters he had helped create, Dracula, Frankenstein, The Mummy, became cultural icons that far outlasted any memory of the corporate struggles that had surrounded their creation. Lemmel also devoted considerable energy to causes that reflected his deepest values. As conditions in Germany deteriorated through the 1930s, he used his resources and connections to help Jewish refugees escape the gathering catastrophe. By some estimates, he provided affidavits and financial support that enabled hundreds of families to reach safety in America. This quiet philanthropy received little attention at the time, but represented perhaps the most meaningful legacy of his wealth and influence. The Germany he had left as a teenager had transformed into something unrecognizable, something monstrous. The relatives he had employed so liberally at Universal, The family connections he had maintained so faithfully across decades and oceans now faced dangers that no amount of money or influence could fully address. Lemmel did what he could, which was more than most, but the scale of the catastrophe exceeded any individual's capacity to respond. His health declined gradually through the late 1930s. The energy that had driven him from Oshkosh clothing stores to Hollywood empire building diminished, replaced by the quiet weariness of age and disappointment. He had outlived his moment, had watched the industry he helped create mature beyond his comprehension, had seen his life's work pass into hands that owed him nothing but acknowledgement. Carl Lemmel died on September 24, 1939, at his home in Beverly Hills. He was 72 years old. The cause was listed as heart disease, the vague diagnosis that covered so many deaths among men of his generation. The timing placed his passing at a moment of global transformation. Germany had invaded Poland 3 weeks earlier, initiating the war that would reshape everything Lemmel had known. The obituaries that appeared in newspapers across the country followed predictable patterns. They recounted his immigrant origins, his rise from Nickelodeon operator to studio chief, his role in breaking the Patents Company monopoly, his creation of Universal City. They noted his generosity, his loyalty to family, his contributions to the development of the motion picture industry. They were respectful, comprehensive, and curiously distant, as though describing a figure from a previous era rather than a man who had died within living memory. Hollywood mourned according to its customs. Memorial services were held. Tributes were delivered. Industry figures who had known Lemmel, who had worked with him, or competed against him, or simply observed his career from appropriate distances, offered reflections calibrated to the expectations of the moment. Then the town returned to its business, which was the manufacture of entertainment for audiences who neither knew nor cared about the men who had built the machinery that served them. Universal itself barely paused to acknowledge its founder's death. The studio was deep in reorganization under its new ownership, struggling to establish stable management and coherent production strategies. The Lemmel era had become an embarrassment to be overcome rather than a legacy to be honored. References to the founder grew scarce in company communications. His portrait, which had once occupied prominent positions throughout Universal City, was quietly relocated to less visible locations. The physical landscape of the studio continued to evolve in ways that erased Lemmel's fingerprints. Buildings he had constructed were demolished or renovated beyond recognition. Backlots he had designed were reconfigured to accommodate new production requirements. The Universal City he had envisioned as a permanent monument to his achievement became raw material for successive waves of transformation. Yet something of his vision persisted beneath the changes. The basic conception of a self-contained production facility, a city within a city dedicated to the manufacture of dreams, remained operational long after its creator's departure. The tourist operations he had pioneered evolved into Universal Studios Hollywood, one of the most visited attractions in Southern California. Visitors who wandered through the theme park had no reason to connect their experience to a German immigrant who had died decades before their births, but they were nonetheless participating in something he had imagined. The horror films that had defined Universal's identity under Junior's leadership achieved an afterlife that exceeded anyone's expectations. Dracula and Frankenstein and their successors became templates for an entire genre. Their imagery and conventions replicated endlessly across decades of subsequent production. The monsters that Universal had created became cultural property, recognized by audiences who had never seen the original films, referenced in contexts far removed from their origins. This strange immortality represented perhaps the most durable element of Carl Lemmel's legacy. He had not personally championed the horror cycle. That had been his son's enthusiasm. But he had created the institutional framework within which those films could be produced, had established the studio culture that gave directors and designers room to pursue unconventional visions. The monsters were Junior's children, but they were Carl's grandchildren, products of an enterprise he had willed into existence. The family that Laemmle had supported so generously scattered after his death. Some remained in the entertainment industry, finding positions at other studios or in related businesses. Others drifted into different fields entirely, their connection to Hollywood becoming a piece of family history rather than a living reality. The network of obligation that had centered on Carl Laemmle dissolved without his presence to sustain it. Junior's trajectory was particularly poignant. Removed from Universal along with his father, he attempted to establish himself as an independent producer to demonstrate that his abilities extended beyond the advantages his name had provided. These efforts met with limited success. The industry that had tolerated his extravagance when his father controlled a studio had little patience for an unaffiliated producer with expensive tastes and uncertain commercial instincts. He lived until 1979, long enough to see the horror films he had championed achieve classic status, long enough to receive belated recognition for his contributions to cinema history. But the decades between his removal from Universal and his death were marked by disappointment and diminished circumstances. The kingdom his father had built for him had been taken away, and nothing adequate had replaced it. The question of what might have been haunts any consideration of the Laemmle legacy. If Carl had been more willing to professionalize Universal's management, to separate family loyalty from business judgment, might the studio have navigated the transition to sound without losing independence? If Junior had possessed greater fiscal discipline, might his genuine talents have found sustainable expression? If the timing had been slightly different, if the depression had been less severe, or the technological transition less demanding, might the outcome have been transformed? These questions have no answers, only speculations. History does not offer controlled experiments. The Laemmles failed for reasons that were specific to their circumstances, but also representative of broader patterns. Family businesses throughout American industry faced similar challenges during this period, similar tensions between personal loyalty and professional management. The motion picture industry was distinctive only in the visibility of its struggles, the public nature of its transformations. What remains certain is that Carl Laemmle built something remarkable from nothing, that he transformed himself from an immigrant with empty pockets into a figure of genuine historical significance. The industry he helped create has become one of America's most influential cultural exports, shaping how people around the world understand narrative, emotion, spectacle. Every film produced anywhere bears some trace of the structures and conventions established during the era when Laemmle and his contemporaries were inventing Hollywood. Universal City still stands in the San Fernando Valley, though almost nothing of Laemmle's original construction survives. The chicken farms he purchased have become one of the most valuable pieces of real estate in the entertainment industry, home to production facilities and theme park attractions that generate revenues he could not have imagined. The name he chose remains attached to the enterprise, a corporate identity that has outlasted every individual associated with its creation. Visitors who pass through the gates today encounter an experience carefully designed to produce wonder and excitement. They ride attractions based on properties that postdate Laemmle's death by decades. They purchase merchandise featuring characters from films produced long after his era. They have no reason to think about the diminutive immigrant who once walked these grounds as their absolute master, who built this place from empty land and impossible ambition. The absence of visible memorial is itself a kind of statement. Hollywood has never been sentimental about its founders, has never maintained the reverence for origins that characterizes older industries. The town exists in a perpetual present tense, endlessly focused on the next production, the next release, the next transformation of public taste. Those who built the machinery are forgotten as soon as their utility expires. Yet Lemmel's ghost persists in structures less visible than monuments. The studio system he helped establish, the methods of production and distribution he pioneered, the relationships between creativity and commerce he navigated, these patterns continue to shape the industry long after his personal influence ended. Every executive who balances artistic ambition against financial constraint operates within frameworks Lemmel helped establish. Every family business that struggles to professionalize without losing its soul recapitulates dilemmas he faced and failed to resolve. The monsters endure as well, those strange children of Universal's desperate years. Dracula still rises from his coffin in endless iterations. Frankenstein's creature still stumbles toward the audiences who fear and pity him. These figures have escaped their origins entirely, becoming mythological presences that belong to no studio, no era, no individual creator. They are collective property now, part of the shared imagination of global culture. Perhaps this dissolution of ownership would have pleased Carl Lemmel, or perhaps it would have troubled him. He was proprietary about his creations, protective of the empire he had built, wounded by its loss in ways that never fully healed. But he was also a showman who understood that entertainment succeeds only when it escapes the control of its creators, when audiences claim it as their own. The monsters belong to everyone now. Universal City belongs to whoever holds the current deed. The Dream Factory continues its operations, producing new dreams for new audiences, while the dreamer who built it fades into the invisibility that claims all founders eventually. In Laupheim, the town of his birth, a small museum preserves artifacts from his life. Photographs show the young Carl before America transformed him, show the prosperous mogul he became, show the facilities he built, and the stars he created. German visitors can trace the trajectory of a local boy who achieved something extraordinary in a distant land. The exhibition is modest, appropriate to a figure whose significance registers fully only within specialized histories. The distance between Laupheim and Universal City measures more than geography. It measures the transformation of a world, the creation of industries and art forms that did not exist when Carl Lemmel was born, the emergence of America as the center of global entertainment. He participated in that transformation, helped drive it, was ultimately consumed by it. His story is not tragedy exactly, nor triumph. It is something more common and more human. A life that mattered, that left marks on the world, that ended in the mixture of achievement and disappointment that characterizes most lives fully lived. The cameras keep rolling at Universal City. The tourists keep coming. The monsters keep rising. And somewhere beneath it all, beneath the attractions and the sound stages and the corporate machinery, the foundation that Carl Lemmel laid continues to support structures he never imagined, serving purposes he could not have foreseen, persisting in the way that institutions persist.